The story begins with a busy director named Dan who tries to stay focused on work while his marriage is falling apart. Even so, Dan tells his friend that he plans to fix things with his wife, Lisa. He and Lisa have even agreed to take a short trip to a cabin owned by his father. Dan says he is tired of the Cold War between them, especially since Lisa is also busy in the film industry. Dan then reminds the man not to forget about going to the cabin the next day. But at this point, we still have no idea what Dan is actually planning to do to his wife. Later, Dan visits his father, who has been in the hospital for 2 weeks. He tells him about the trip with Lisa, and his father hopes their marriage can finally become loving and peaceful again. Back at home, Dan, who is planning to sell the house, quickly hides the rope and duct tape he has prepared. Not long after, Lisa arrives, and she does not look excited about their trip at all. However, Dan already has a plan, and this is over your dead body. Dan tries to make his wife happy instead of constantly fighting over meaningless things, but Lisa is more interested in the movie dialogue she is working on. She then questions why Dan never involves her in any of his films or commercials. That question quickly turns into another argument, especially because Dan refuses to give her a clear answer. When they arrive at the cabin, Lisa acts like a big celebrity and tells Dan to carry all their supplies. Ironically, in most of the films she has appeared in, Lisa has mostly played small extra roles. Still, at least this trip seems to make her look a little happier. While they are settling in, Dan notices that his sweater is missing. He remembers leaving it in the closet last winter. But to Lisa, that is not important at all. She would rather have Dan cook something delicious before she gets even hungrier. While eating meat, Dan brings up a man named Dario, someone Lisa has been talking about a lot lately. Dario is Lisa's acting coach, and he is also working on a film with her. Dan says he is proud that Lisa is starting to enter the world of directing, just like him. That night, they try to spend time together by playing games that should help them reconnect. But instead of bringing them closer, it only leads to another pointless fight. By now, Dan realizes there may be nothing left to fix.
I'm going to bed.
Even going to bed feels unbearable when he has to lie next to a woman who constantly gets on his nerves.
Insane in that scene.
Well,
Like,
no,
she's
I'm
like,
glad that she didn't kill him.
Have to suffer. It's just
The next morning, Dan begins collecting a pile of rocks and secretly loads them into a boat. It turns out his real reason for coming to the cabin was never to save his marriage. He planned to drown Lisa in the lake. Once everything is ready, Dan quietly prepares a chloroform-soaked cloth. But before making his move, he takes a drink to build up the courage he needs to go through with it. Things immediately take an unexpected turn. Lisa has already figured out what Dan is planning, and before he can act, she shocks him with a stun gun. She had even noticed him loading all those rocks into the boat earlier. At that point, Lisa realizes the truth. Everything Dan has been doing was part of a plan to kill her. Forced to explain himself, Dan finally reveals what pushed him this far. He admits that he knows about her affair with Dario, her acting coach. He had seen the two getting far too close at a recent celebration, and to him, it was obvious their relationship had gone beyond acting lessons. Lisa then confronts Dan about something else. For the past 2 years, he has completely avoided intimacy with her. Dan finally unloads years of frustration, explaining how worthless and ignored he has felt throughout their marriage. He even criticizes Lisa's acting abilities and admits that this is why he never cast her in any of his projects. Before long, the two are blaming each other for everything that went wrong. The story then jumps back to the previous day. Lisa had already been suspicious when Dan suddenly suggested a romantic getaway to the cabin. Around that time, she also introduced him to Henry, the gardener who happened to be one of Dan's old high school friends. As it turns out, Lisa's instincts were right all along. When Henry arrives at the cabin, Dan seems strangely relieved. The reason soon becomes clear. Henry is the man Dan secretly recruited to help murder Lisa, and without warning, Henry knocks her unconscious. The story then rewinds even further, this time to 5 days earlier. Back then, Dan approached Henry with a proposal. If he helped kill Lisa, he would receive half of her life insurance payout. With Henry's help, Dan finally gains the upper hand. Meanwhile, Lisa vents about the pressure she has been under, especially having to work while Dan's career continues to decline and his debts keep piling up. Then Henry casually admits that he is only involved because of the insurance money. Hearing that, Lisa immediately changes tactics. Instead of pleading for mercy, she offers Henry a better deal and suggests they work together instead. Dan reacts instantly, trying to suffocate Lisa with a plastic bag. But to his surprise, Henry suddenly points a gun at him. Henry forces Dan to back off and gives Lisa a chance to speak. Lisa then turns the offer around and suggests that Henry kill Dan instead. If her husband dies, she promises Henry can have the entire insurance payout. The situation quickly spirals out of control. All three begin struggling over the weapon. During the chaos, Dan and Lisa accidentally grab the gun at the same time, and a stray shot ends up killing Henry. Both of them panic as they stare at Henry's body. Dan immediately blames Lisa for what happened, and another violent fight breaks out between them. As they continue struggling, the gun fires again by accident. This time, the bullet strikes the ceiling. Suddenly, something crashes down from above. Dan and Lisa are knocked unconscious after three strangers fall through the attic and land right on top of them. So who are these people? The answer takes us back 3 days earlier. A prison guard named Allegra helped two inmates escape from prison. Since then, the fugitives have been hiding in the woods, trying to stay out of sight and avoid the police. The following day, Allegra and the escaped convicts stumble upon Dan's cabin while it is still empty. Allegra is not just a corrupt prison guard. She is also romantically involved with one of the inmates, a man named Pete. The pair are looking for food and shelter, but they are also searching for a private place to spend time together while on the run. Before continuing their escape, they help themselves to Dan's clothes and use them to change their appearance. But just as they are getting comfortable, Dan and Lisa unexpectedly arrive at the cabin. With nowhere else to go, the fugitives are forced to hide on the roof and wait for an opportunity to escape. While hiding, Allegra and Pete debate what to do. They are unsure whether it would be safer to kill Dan and Lisa or simply stay hidden until the couple leaves. In the end, they choose to remain on the roof, even though the situation becomes increasingly uncomfortable. After spending hours in hiding, they notice Henry arriving at the cabin to meet Dan. Still, they refuse to reveal themselves. That changes when a stray bullet suddenly hits Todd in the backside. Not long after, the fugitives finally emerge and take Dan and Lisa hostage. The couple is completely confused about who these three strangers are, but after introducing themselves, the criminals quickly make their intentions clear. They are there to rob them. Pete demands access to all of Dan and Lisa's bank accounts. The problem is that Dan barely has any money. In fact, he has not even been paid for his latest advertising project yet. The criminals refuse to believe him. Determined to force the truth out of him, Allegra comes up with another plan.
Down to the laundry room, where it was nice and quiet. We would see who could fuck who first. And then draw this big circle around.
Since Dan keeps insisting that he is broke, he is forced into a brutal fight with Todd. And if he loses, things will only get worse from there. Unfortunately for Dan, he never stands a chance against a human wrecking machine like Todd. During the ordeal, Pete suddenly realizes that Dan is actually a film director whose work he used to enjoy. Instantly, Pete starts imagining how much money he could make by robbing someone famous. But Dan continues insisting that he has no fortune to steal. The criminals are ready to escalate things even further, but their plans are briefly interrupted when Todd runs into a problem of his own. Once that issue is dealt with, Allegra decides she will simply shoot Dan if he continues refusing to hand over any money. At that moment, Lisa comes up with a lie. She claims that she has a large amount of money sitting in a bank account and says all they need to do is visit the bank to withdraw it. Surprisingly, the story works and finally stops the criminals from hurting Dan. As they wait for morning, Allegra removes the bullet fragment from Todd's injured backside. Meanwhile, Lisa reflects on how miserable her life has become. Things were already difficult before this nightmare began, and now she and Dan have become victims of a violent robbery on top of everything else. Eventually, Lisa opens up about her affair with Dario. She admits that the relationship started as an escape from the broken and unhappy marriage she shared with Dan. While Dan and Lisa are being held captive, the criminals are already planning what comes next. Once they collect the money that does not actually exist, they intend to get rid of both of them. The plan is simple. They will take Lisa to the bank, force her to withdraw the cash, then drive her out to a remote field and kill her. After that, they even plan to sink Dan's car in the lake. As Dan looks around the cabin, he notices a billiard ball that could potentially be used as a weapon. After secretly pocketing it, he pretends that he needs to use the bathroom, hoping to create an opportunity to fight back. Pete tells Todd to escort Dan before their hostage has an accident in his pants. Todd warns Dan not to even think about running away. If he wants to avoid a painful end, he needs to cooperate. Before heading to the bathroom, Todd carefully removes anything that could be used as a weapon. What he does not realize is that Dan is already carrying the heavy billiard ball. The moment they leave the bathroom, Dan makes his move and smashes Todd in the head. With Todd unconscious, Dan tells Lisa to escape on her own using a knife. He plans to slip away while Pete and Allegra are distracted by each other. Meanwhile, Pete begins wondering why Todd has not returned. It does not take long for him and Allegra to discover that their giant enforcer has failed to keep watch over the hostages. At the same time, Dan and Lisa rush out of the cabin and hide nearby. The criminals split up and begin searching for them. As Lisa attempts to escape, she realizes that Todd hid the car keys somewhere inside the cabin. Unfortunately, Todd soon returns to grab a flashlight and ends up finding Lisa in the kitchen. Just as she finally gets hold of the keys, Todd's arrival ruins her chance to escape. By now, Todd no longer cares about money. All he wants is revenge against Dan and Lisa. Desperate to save herself, Lisa suddenly claims that she is pregnant as a result of her affair. The revelation hits Dan like a truck. Hearing that Lisa might be carrying Dario's child leaves him completely stunned. Todd, however, could not care less. He is determined to kill her anyway. Before Todd can act, Dan strikes him in the head once again, and another violent struggle breaks out. Todd proves just how terrifying he really is. Even after taking a brutal beating, he keeps coming. Lisa repeatedly stabs him in the back with a knife, yet he somehow remains standing. Despite being covered in wounds, the dangerous convict refuses to go down. Eventually, Lisa begins to accept that this psychopath may actually kill them both. At the last possible moment, Dan attacks Todd again. This time, the massive convict finally collapses for good, but their relief is short-lived. Moments later, they hear Pete and Allegra approaching. Realizing they have only a brief window to escape, Lisa urges Dan to head for the boat. When Pete and Allegra discover Todd's body, they are absolutely furious. Their hunt for Dan and Lisa immediately becomes far more personal. Meanwhile, Dan and Lisa hide inside a closet after hearing Pete and Allegra return. While they are hiding, Dan finally reflects on everything that has happened. He realizes that he has spent years neglecting Lisa and failing to care about her feelings. At the same time, he has no idea how to repair a marriage that has already been shattered, especially after learning about her affair. In his mind, that hopelessness was what led him to give up and decide to kill her in the first place. Believing that Lisa is carrying a child, Dan tells her to head to the boat first and save herself. That is when Lisa finally admits the truth. The pregnancy story was completely made up. She only said it to survive her encounter with Todd. Unfortunately, their hiding place is soon discovered. The moment Pete finds them, Dan attacks him. As Dan keeps Pete occupied, Lisa makes a run for the lake. But the criminals have no intention of letting either of them escape. Pete quickly gains the upper hand again, even launching himself from the second floor before brutally beating Dan. Dan soon becomes the main target of Pete's rage. Desperate to save her husband, Lisa grabs a weapon and slashes Pete across the back. But then the impossible happens. Todd suddenly reappears. Despite all the injuries he suffered earlier, he is somehow still alive. With Todd back in the fight, Dan and Lisa are completely outmatched once again. At this point, the criminals no longer care about money. Revenge is all that matters. They simply want Dan and Lisa dead. Just when Dan is moments away from being shredded by the lawnmower, a speeding car suddenly crashes into Pete. The rescue comes from an unexpected source. Earlier that night, a nearby resident had heard screams coming from the cabin and informed Dan's father, who was still recovering in the hospital. Before dawn, Dan's father sneaks out of the hospital to investigate what is happening at his cabin. In the process, he even steals a nurse's sports car from the hospital parking lot. What he finds is far worse than he ever imagined. His son's vacation has turned into a nightmare, and there is no way he is going to stand by while his family's in danger. Without hesitation, he grabs a shotgun and opens fire on Todd. Dan's father then turns his attention to Pete, especially after seeing the damage Pete has done to Dan, including costing him 2 fingers. However, the rescue does not go as planned. Allegra attacks from behind and strikes Dan's father. Even so, he refuses to give up. With the little strength he has left, he lunges forward and bites Pete in the face, dragging him into a struggle. The distraction gives Dan and Lisa a chance to escape, just as Dan's father wanted. Sadly, the effort costs him his life. Dan and Lisa rush to flee, but Pete once again manages to ruin their escape. During the chaos, the vehicle they are driving crashes straight into a large tree. Lisa panics after realizing that a shotgun blast has grazed her and damaged part of her hair. Seeing no other option, Dan tells Lisa to head for the lake while he stays behind to avenge his father's death. At the same time, Allegra is screaming in pain after Dan's father shattered her leg with a shotgun blast. But instead of helping her, Pete decides she is nothing but dead weight and leaves her behind. Pete immediately goes looking for Dan and Lisa, only to discover that the crashed vehicle is already empty. Meanwhile, Allegra is shocked that the man she risked everything for has abandoned her so easily. Desperate to survive, she tries treating her mangled leg. But before she can do much, Dan suddenly appears. Still furious over his father's death, Dan kicks Allegra's injured leg, causing her even more agony. After everything she and her gang have done, Dan has no sympathy left. As he confronts her, he cannot help but complain about one thing in particular. Throughout this nightmare, the fugitives have been wearing his clothes. Allegra tries apologizing, especially for Pete's role in killing Dan's father, but Dan is far beyond forgiveness at this point. Without hesitation, he shoots Allegra and kills her on the spot. Meanwhile, Lisa is discovered by Pete. At the same time, Dan recovers his favorite sweater from Allegra's body. Moments later, he hears the sound of a speeding boat and realizes Lisa is in danger. He immediately rushes toward the lake. By the time he arrives, Pete and Lisa are already out on the water. Luckily, Dan manages to grab onto a rope attached to the boat and is dragged through the lake behind them. Even now, Pete is still obsessed with the money Lisa claimed to have. As he focuses on that, Lisa notices Dan trailing behind the boat and cleverly distracts Pete long enough for Dan to climb aboard. Once on the boat, Dan immediately attacks Pete. For the first time in the entire story, Dan and Lisa fight side by side as a team. Together, they do everything they can to stop the relentless criminal. Eventually, Pete gains the upper hand and nearly kills Dan by choking him. As Dan struggles to stay alive, Lisa suddenly remembers the rocks Dan had gathered earlier for his original murder plan. Realizing they can finally serve a different purpose, she uses them against Pete. The weight drags Pete into the water and begins pulling him under. But the danger is not over yet. As Pete sinks, Dan's leg becomes tangled in the same rope. He is dragged into the lake as well and begins disappearing beneath the surface. With all her strength, Lisa fights to pull him back up. After an exhausting struggle, she finally succeeds in rescuing him. With Pete gone and the nightmare finally over, Dan and Lisa return to the cabin. There, they reflect on everything that has happened and sincerely apologize to one another. Dan especially apologizes for the terrible things he planned to do to Lisa. Lisa also takes responsibility for her own mistakes. Together, they promise to rebuild their relationship and become better people. They decide that if they truly want a healthy and loving marriage, they need to face life's problems together instead of turning against each other. Later, Dan and Lisa contact the police and report the crimes committed by the gang. Notably, neither of them mentions Dan's original plan to murder Lisa. Instead, they focus on telling authorities about the criminals who kidnapped, robbed, and attacked them. Because both Dan and Lisa are public figures, news of the incident quickly spreads. Their incredible survival story attracts massive attention, and they soon find themselves appearing on news programs and podcasts to share their experience. The irony is that the horrifying ordeal ends up bringing them closer together. Inspired by everything that happened, Dan decides to turn the experience into a movie so people can see just how dangerous those criminals really were. Several months later, his dream project finally becomes a reality. Of course, the movie version takes a few creative liberties. In Dan's film, he and Lisa are portrayed as fearless action heroes who take down waves of criminals without much trouble. To Dan's surprise, Lisa actually delivers a strong performance, proving that she has more talent than he ever gave her credit for. The film is expected to be a major success, and for the first time in a long while, it looks like both their marriage and their finances are finally heading in the right direction. So the moral of the story is, if your marriage is falling apart, maybe try couples therapy before upgrading to murder plots, insurance scams, escaped convicts, and a lake boss battle.